That's excellent, because that little interlude there lasted more or less as long as the first flights, which were just little suborbital ballistic hops, and lasted about 15 minutes, and took the astronauts only about 200 miles away from where they'd taken off from. But that was enough, even in those early days, to get the whole world fantastically excited by what seemed like the possibilities of the future. And within just a few years of these early adventures, you had things like Thunderbirds coming along. And what Thunderbirds did, it reached American and English and I think European audience as well, and it just put into the minds of all young people, indeed all family audiences, yes, the future is coming, and the future is going to involve spacemen and spacewomen, we hope, and rockets and all kinds of adventures. And it just seemed inevitable. Science fiction in the 1940s and 1950s had got out of the Second World War and looked around and said, well, can we make a better future? Can we use technology to do better than we've done in the past with all these concentration camps and all these atom bombs and all this destruction and cruelty? And science fiction thought, well, yes, we can. And it assumed that the way to do this, in part at least, was to get out into space and use the resources of space. The other thing is that in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the early 60s, the best telescope astronomers in the world were looking at Mars and looking at Venus. And they were thinking, well, there's maybe no aliens on them like you had in Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom novels. Maybe there's nothing civilized out there, but if we look at Mars, can't we see some kind of seasonal changes in primitive vegetation, some kind of lichen clinging to the rocks, something anyway. As late as 1960, 1961, probably right up until the very verge of the first Mariner spacecrafts to Mars, there was a faint hope at least that you might actually find something on Mars that was going to be life. Primitive maybe, but it would be enough to demonstrate that, you know, if life can happen on another world, then life in the cosmos is out there in a more broader sense. And that was enough to get everybody excited about going to Mars, and it just made the whole thing seem fantastically possible. So again, 1960, 1961, you live on this teetering of a fantastic optimism for space exploration. Now, by the late 1960s, the world on the ground had really turned bad. We had the civil rights disturbances in the United States, and we had the Vietnam War. We had an awful lot of assassinations and problems, and it looked as though the other thing that was happening is that the Western world was turning against its own technology. 1961, when the first rockets went up, everybody said, yay! But by about 1966, 67, there was this, rockets are the man, rockets are just the nuclear man, rockets are just the big corporations, rockets are just white middle-class men. What about the poor Vietnamese people? What about all the people who are not involved? And why should we spend our money on this? But still, there was that overhang of optimism from the early days, and Star Trek came along and said, look, we'll get over these problems one day. Space is big, space is vast. Anytime now, we're going to have this real future where international people can have international missions into the depths of space, and you know, it'll all happen. Just wait, be patient. We'll have black people kissing white people, we'll have Vietnamese people and Korean people piloting the spaceships, with an American in command, of course, naturally. It's all going to be okay. You know, we come in peace, but our faces are armed, that kind of thing. Still that enormous sense of optimism. So even through the 1967s, with the turmoil and the distrust in technology in the real world, there was still that sense that, okay, one day the future, the actual future is going to happen. But in the 1970s and 1980s, this new movement in culture and politics and intellectualism came along called postmodernism. And what this did is to say, look, there's no such thing as a future. All that happens is new things get bolted onto the past. And there's no such thing as human progress with a sort of destined arrival at some plateau of perfectibility. All that happens is we kind of muddle through from one day to the next. And there's no such thing as civilization being more superior to other civilizations. Everybody's equal rank, and nothing is worth any more than anything else. And also, all of those countries that used to have empires, they're bad and evil and wicked, and they've exported nothing but doom. So there was this huge, huge, huge period in the 70s and 80s, and probably into modern times, where all the assumptions that the Western world had made from the Renaissance onward, that rationalistic scientific progress was going to take them somewhere and was going to lead to a better and better world, all of that began to look uncertain. And the greatest visual symbol of those old hopes was the space age. And so, in fact, by the time the moon landings began to happen, confidence in the space age was already being eroded. And the best example of this is a magnificent movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I'm sure you've all seen. It was released in 1968, just on the verge of the Apollo missions. And it showed, the technological predictions that it made about flat screens and the relationship between human beings and machinery, 40 years later, it still looks astonishing. That looks as though it might have been filmed last week. It's fantastic what they got right. But what they got wrong was this automatic assumption that in just 40 years after them, or 30 years after the moon landings, there would be giant space stations, and there would be a giant commerce in the sky, and there would be giant moon bases and all of this sort of infrastructure. Even in 1969, as they geared up for the first landings, NASA's budgets were being cut, because politicians and people alike were beginning to recognize that they didn't know really how they were going to take the space adventure much further forward than landing on the moon, putting a flag there, and coming home again. Also, the public was beginning to understand that science fiction movies and science fiction books, and all those science fiction illustrations of tremendous vistas of alien landscapes was one thing, but the reality was another. It was these very brave men flying in very cramped capsules on top of converted missiles. I mean, this is one vision of spaceflight where you have lots of room. But the reality is that space is essentially a claustrophobic experience. Your view of space is limited to what you can see through your helmet visor because you're surviving through the vacuum, or the windows of your spacecraft, which is basically a small tin can, essentially like a kind of submarine that you can't really venture outside of unless you wear this heavy protective gear. This is a Gemini, this is the two-man Gemini, and they're about to close the door on these two astronauts in there for 10 days or more, because at that time they were testing to see whether or not human beings could survive long enough for the trips to the moon. And so it was a very, very, very tough thing. And by the time they closed the doors and put these people up into orbit, by about day 7 or day 8, even the toughest astronauts were saying, look, can we maybe come home a day early, or it's kind of cramped in here, and we're fed up, and I think we've achieved our mission objectives. And NASA said, no, just hold on, you'll be okay, just hold on there, prove you can stay up there for long enough. So the truth is that space is not a comfortable environment to go and occupy and have fun in it. It still requires a lot of bravery and determination to explore it, because you're inside these very cramped tin cans. In the old days, of course, you had the visions of Thunderbirds and so on, but there was a disconnect between the science fiction visions and the truth of landing these capsules down in the water, where actually the astronauts, after a week or two in space, surviving all the hazards of launch and re-entry, they're actually in serious danger of drowning when they smash into the landing. It's a serious hazard. There are constant memos flying around at NASA saying it would be really, really embarrassing if we got these guys down as heroes and we landed them safely and then they drowned because we couldn't get a helicopter to them. And one of the Mercury astronauts nearly did drown because the helicopter saw him in the water waving his arms around like this, and they said, he's okay, he's telling us go and recover the capsule before that sinks. But actually he wasn't. He was saying, it's not a capsule, I'm drowning, because the water was coming down through he didn't have his helmet on, so he very nearly did drown. So it was a pretty hazardous thing. So the public clapped and applauded and celebrated the bravery of these guys, but they did wonder, well, come on, when are they going to start building real spaceships? Now this is the other thing that happened. What we're looking at here is this fantastic array of electromechanical devices inside an Apollo command module.